Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Cheating Wife Revelations, the podcast where we dive deep into the unexpected, the dramatic, and sometimes downright shocking stories of infidelity. Today's story will keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. So, imagine this: you're at a glamorous party, the kind where the champagne flows freely, and the laughter echoes through the halls. You're there with your spouse, and for a moment, everything feels perfect. But then, your world turns upside down in the most unimaginable way. Stick around as we unravel the story of a jaw-dropping proposition, a weekend that changed everything, and the fallout that followed. Let's get into it. The invitation to the party arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a glossy black envelope with silver lettering that stood out starkly against the mundane stack of bills and junk mail. It was from my boss, Mr. David Chambers, the CEO of the company where I worked as a senior project manager. David was known for his extravagant parties, and this one, held at his mansion, promised to be the event of the season. "Are you going to this?" my wife, Maria, asked as she glanced over my shoulder at the invitation. "I suppose we should," I replied, not particularly enthused. Office parties weren't really my thing, but missing one of David's events was practically career suicide. "Sounds fun," Maria said with a smile. "I could use a night out." I returned her smile, feeling a bit more optimistic. Maybe this party would be a good thing. It had been a while since Maria and I had done anything together outside of our usual routine. Saturday night arrived, and Maria and I dressed to the nines for the party. She wore a stunning red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, while I opted for a classic black suit. As we drove to David's mansion, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. David was a charismatic but demanding boss, and I never knew what to expect at his gatherings. David's mansion was even more impressive than I remembered. The grand entrance was flanked by statues and fountains, and the interior was filled with opulent decorations, a testament to his wealth and status. We were greeted by a valet who took our car, and then we made our way inside. The party was in full swing when we arrived. The main hall was filled with people, all dressed in their finest attire, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. We mingled, chatted with colleagues, and enjoyed the lavish spread of food and drinks. As the night went on, I noticed David making his rounds, charming his guests as always. Eventually, he made his way over to us. "Garnett, Maria, so glad you could make it," David exclaimed, giving us both a warm smile. "Thank you for inviting us," I replied, shaking his hand. "Maria, you look stunning," David said, his gaze lingering on her a bit too long for my liking. She blushed and thanked him, and I felt a twinge of jealousy. "Enjoying the party?" David asked, turning his attention back to me. "Absolutely," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. Good, he said, nodding. "Actually, Garnett, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Can we step outside for a moment?" "Of course," I said, though I couldn't help but feel a bit apprehensive. We followed David out to a quiet balcony overlooking the garden. The night was cool, and the sound of the party faded into the background. "I'll get straight to the point," David said, leaning against the railing. "You know the company's been going through some tough times recently." I nodded, unsure where this was leading. "We're making some cuts, restructuring," he continued. "But you've always been a valuable asset to the team, Garnett. I want to ensure you stay with us and even get a nice bonus for your hard work." "That sounds great," I said, though I knew there had to be a catch. "But there's something I need from you in return," David said, his tone shifting. "This weekend, I'll be spending time with your wife, and for this favor, you'll keep your job and get that bonus." My jaw dropped, and I felt a surge of anger. I was ready to knock him out with one punch, but before I could react, Maria stepped forward. "I agree," she said, her voice steady. I stared at her in disbelief. "Maria, what are you saying?" She looked at me with a mix of resignation and determination. "Garnett, we need this. You know how much this job means to you, to us. We can't afford to lose it." I was stunned, unable to process what was happening. David looked at us both, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Excellent," he said. "I'll make the arrangements." The ride home from the party was tense and silent. My mind was racing, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Maria and I didn't speak a word until we were inside the house. "Maria, how could you agree to that?" I finally asked, my voice filled with anger and hurt. She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Garnett, I did it for us. For you. We can't afford for you to lose your job. What choice did we have?" "There had to be another way," I said, pacing the room. "We could have figured something out." "Like what?" she shot back. "Tell me, what other options did we have? We've been struggling for months, and this job is our lifeline." I stopped and looked at her, my anger softening. She was right, we had been struggling. But the idea of her spending the weekend with David was something I couldn't accept. "I can't let you do this," I said quietly. "It's already done," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The weekend arrived, and I watched as Maria packed a small bag. I felt a sense of helplessness wash over me. This was really happening. "Are you sure about this?" I asked one last time, hoping she would change her mind. She nodded, avoiding my gaze. "Yes, Garnett. It's the only way." I drove her to David's mansion, the journey filled with an unbearable silence. When we arrived, David was waiting at the door, a smug expression on his face. Maria got out of the car and walked towards him, her head held high. "See you on Monday," David said to me, his tone dripping with condescension. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to hit him. Instead, I turned and drove away, my heart heavy with anger and despair. The weekend was a blur of emotions. I couldn't eat, sleep, or think clearly. I spent most of the time pacing the house, my mind filled with thoughts of what was happening between Maria and David. When she finally returned on Sunday evening, she looked exhausted but resolute. I wanted to ask her what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "We did what we had to do," she said simply. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The following weeks at work were unbearable. David acted as if nothing had happened, but I could feel his eyes on me every time I passed by his office. My colleagues noticed the tension, but no one dared to ask what was going on. Maria and I tried to move on, but the incident had driven a wedge between us. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained and awkward. The trust and intimacy we once shared were shattered. One evening, as we sat in silence over dinner, I finally broke down. "Maria, we can't go on like this. We need to talk about what happened." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I know, Garnett. But I don't know how." "We need to figure this out," I said, reaching for her hand. "We can't let this destroy us." She nodded, squeezing my hand. "I want to fix this. I want us to be okay." We decided to see a marriage counselor, hoping to find a way to rebuild our relationship. The sessions were difficult, forcing us to confront the pain and betrayal we both felt. But slowly, we began to make progress. Through therapy, we learned to communicate better, to understand each other's needs and fears. It wasn't an easy process, but it was necessary. We started to reconnect, finding ways to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It took time, but eventually, we began to heal. Our relationship wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was stronger in some ways. We had faced a tremendous challenge and come out the other side, more resilient and committed to each other. Despite the progress Maria and I had made, I couldn't shake the feeling of anger and resentment towards David. He had manipulated us, used his power to put us in an impossible situation, and I wasn't sure I could ever forgive him for that. One day, I decided to confront him. I walked into his office, closing the door behind me. "David, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. He looked up from his desk, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, Garnett?" "I want you to know that what you did was unforgivable," I said, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You used your power to manipulate us, and you crossed a line that should never have been crossed." David leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "I did what I had to do. Business is business, Garnett. You should understand that by now." This isn't about business, I replied, my anger rising. This is about basic human decency. You exploited us, and for that, I will never forgive you. He shrugged, seemingly unfazed. That's your choice. But remember, Garnett, I hold the power here. You'd do well to remember that. I left his office, feeling a mix of anger and frustration.